Let's talk about how you can revise your draft. First of all, revision is very different from editing. Revision has to do with making big changes to the story itself and how it's written, whereas editing, which we'll cover later, has a lot more to do with spelling, grammar, mechanics, little things like that. So revision, I like to say revision is rewriting, okay? You are basically rewriting your story after you look at it with fresh eyes to make it a better story, to make it more interesting, to make it more clear, more enjoyable, things like that. So let's look at different ways that you are going to demonstrate your revisions and different ways that you can put on a new set of eyes, as I like to say, as you look at your draft. So the way this little table is set up for you, and this is a table that you'll be filling out as you revise your draft. The type of revision is over here. The description of what that means is here. Then I want you to note changes that you make to your draft that have to do with each type of revision and why you made those changes. Remember, to get a 4 on the proficiency scale for this learning target, as always, you need to also be able to explain yourself, okay? Explain your learning. And so that has to do, in this case, with justifying the changes that you make to your draft as it pertains to each of these types of revisions. So let's just break them down one by one. The first type of revision has to do with setting. Here's the description. Make sure that it's very clear to your reader where and when the story is taking place. It's very hard to get into a story if you don't know where it is and when it is. Okay, that's the first step. You got to dip your toe in the water first before you jump in, right? And establishing your setting or your exposition, if we're talking about the plot pyramid terms that we learned before, establishing that is the dipping of the toe in the water, so to speak. Okay. Otherwise, if you don't have your setting established, your reader will be very disoriented. They won't understand anything from the get-go, and they're going to give up on your story and abandon it pretty quickly, right? The second sentence here says you should only include the setting details that are necessary for setting the stage. Okay? So if your story, like mine that I wrote, has to do with having a new baby and having a dog that runs away and dealing with all that, if I get carried away in describing every detail of my house, that might not be pertinent details, and that can also lose my reader. If I include too many details that are not relevant or interesting, and they don't help to tell the story. So it's always a fine line with details. You have to try to figure out how to give enough and the pertinent details, as I like to say, or the most relevant details to your story without going too far. Nobody wants to hear somebody prattle on and on. You all listen to me prattle on and on sometimes and you get bored. Well, don't let your reader get bored in the same way. Okay? Now, if you notice, this entire thing is a link. So if you read this description and you listen to my description just now and you still need a little more information to really know how to establish setting, click on this link and it's going to take you to a blog post all about how to do this. Story setting ideas, 6 effective setting examples and tips. So I like this blog post. I found it and linked it here because it gives you real details from mentor texts. We talked last semester about mentor texts, and if you got to 4 and 5 on the proficiency scale for your draft, it's because you showed me that you used a mentor text and showed me how you were kind of emulating from that mentor text. Well, this blog post does the exact same thing, and hey, it even talks about J.K. Rowling and Harry Potter, which is what I used in that example first semester when you were brainstorming and drafting. And I showed you how I use that as inspiration. Well, this talks in detail about how J.K. Rowling does a good job of establishing setting and how you can do that too in your story. Number 2 is about Charles Dickens, okay? And if you're in my honors course, you'll read some Charles Dickens most likely. But he's known as being a very descriptive writer. without crossing the line and giving details that aren't necessary. So he's kind of a master of that. So here's an example from him you can look at. So these links on this document here is if you need more information, if you want to look at a couple examples. Okay, I don't need you to take notes or anything, as always, for me. So don't feel like you have to read every word of that blog post. Read enough to get a feeling for how you need to revise your draft to make sure you're establishing setting in a good way. Okay, so after you study that and you look at your draft, you make some changes to and additions to your setting, or maybe take out some details. Here's a spot for you to just tell me how you did that. What did you do? Okay, so you might say something like, I took too much time to describe my house. I cut these details out. Okay, so I might say something like that, for example. And maybe I did other things too. So I just hit enter and say what else I did here. Okay. Now, why you made these changes. So I would say, my story is set in my house, but the details I included didn't help to move the story along. My story has to do with my dog running away, and most of the action actually happens outside. So that's a justification for why I made this change to my setting. So that's kind of how this little chart works. Alright, let's take a look at the rest of this. Sensory details. Sensory details have to do with your senses. You know about your 5 senses. Well, as it says here, make sure you include details about what you or other characters you wrote about saw, heard, smelled, tasted, and touched. Okay, those are your senses. When you include these details, the readers feel transported into your story. So a lot of times you hear when you're getting advice about writing, you should show your reader something, not tell your reader something. Show, don't tell. And what that means is, if you include a lot of descriptive sensory details that describe what your characters are experiencing with their senses, then you show your reader what it's like to be living in your world that you've created in your story. So you want to do that as much as possible. Now, I highly suggest you check out examples on this one, because this can be a hard one for students. Oops, this link isn't working. I'll have to relink that. But this is, again, a resource for you that gives you examples of how to include sensory details in an effective way. So make sure you check that out. Make sure any changes you make, you put here, and over here, you justify why you made those changes. Emotional details. So just like how you just make your reader feel their senses inside of your story, you need to make them feel emotions in your story. So make sure you describe how certain events, especially very emotionally charged ones, make your characters feel. And use language in a way that makes your readers feel that emotion as well. So once again, we have a blog post here that tells you how to write emotion effectively. Gives examples. It's not a very long post, and it's well worth the read. I suggest you at least glance at it to get an idea for how you can make changes, note your changes here, and then justify your changes. Obviously, as you're doing this, you are making changes on the draft itself, and that's explained in detail in the directions on the playlist, so just make sure you take a look at that. Next, sequence of events. Make sure you told your story in an order that makes sense and is easy to follow. Obviously, you should follow the sequence of events as they occurred. So there's no link here because really it's sort of common sense, but maybe you put some details out of order on accident as you were writing before. drafting in a hurry. So just make sure that you read through it and it makes sense in the order that you put it. And maybe you have nothing to say here. I want to make clear, changes you made, you aren't necessarily, you don't have to make changes on every single one of them. In fact, on sequence of events, most of you probably got the sequence correct the first time. It's just something I want you to double check. So I'm going to take this as an opportunity to show you what you should do if you don't have any changes. Just say no changes. You would still justify that over here. I told my story in the order it occurred, and it makes sense. And my spelling, as always, is questionable. Plot elements. Make sure that your story includes all the plot elements besides exposition, which this checklist already covered. So you've already, up here at the top, when we talked about setting, you already checked for setting. But let's look at the rest of the plot elements. Okay, inciting incident, rising action, climax, resolution. So are all of those plot elements present in your story? You should have checked for this when you were drafting. In fact, you should have designed your brainstorming plan from the very beginning this way. So all of them should be there. You're just double checking here. Did you make it clear what started it all? Okay, that's your inciting incident. Did you describe events that led to the big climax of your story? That's the rising action. Is your climax actually written in a way that excites the reader? That's your climax. Did you somehow resolve the climax in a satisfying way? That's your resolution. So this is a link actually to a document that you've seen before. The plot structure components. This is the exact same thing that you studied when you were building your story to begin with. But as a refresher, in case you forgot what any of these things mean, and you need to double check that they're all there in your story and you can identify them, that's there for your reference. So perhaps your climax is there, but it actually wasn't very exciting as you're reading it again. Because again, you have read a lot and written a lot since you drafted this initially last semester. So you might have a better handle now on what the climax of a story is like and what it should feel like for your reader. So maybe you say, I enhanced my climax. I added more sensory description. We'll say sensory and emotional description. Yada yada yada. I'm not going to go on here, but you would get more specific. You would maybe list here what descriptions you included that weren't there before and justify it over here. Okay? I needed to add that because my climax wasn't actually very climactic. Finally, voice is the last thing you're going to look at. And this means, does your narrator and characters have distinct and consistent voices and points of view? What does that mean? We haven't talked a whole lot about this one yet, so it's probably pretty important that you take a look at this link. Types of narrative voice. And again, I'm not going to read this to you, but I want you to look through it, and they explain here the difference between the author's voice and the narrator's voice, because even if you're telling a story, a personal story, your narrator does not have to have the same voice as you as a person, and that seems confusing. But read through this and it gives a good description of what that means. It also can help you with establishing the voice of your characters. You want to have a consistent voice for your characters. If you're reading a story and a character in one scene has this sort of attitude and personality, and then in the next scene their personality seems completely changed, that'll be inconsistent. That will confuse your reader. So you want to establish consistency of your characters. Okay? Give them a persona and stick with that. And again, here you would note your changes, and over here you would explain your changes. And that is how you can get up to a 4 on your learning playlist for the revision part. Now we'll take a look at editing here in a bit, which is very different.